Hey, this is Sean from Math Swap Tutoring, and in this video, I want to talk about perhaps the biggest reason people go into real estate investing: cash flow. Let's go. All right, so let's talk about cash flow. Cash flow is an aspect of real estate investing that's actually pretty simple, very straightforward. All right, so let's go here. So cash flow is equal to annual rental income minus annual debt service minus annual operating expenses. Okay. All right. So cash flow is equal to your annual rental income minus annual debt service minus annual operating expenses. Let's break this down. So basically, you buy a house with the intent to rent it out to somebody. And when you buy it, you get a mortgage on the house. You get a tenant in the house who rents the house from you. The annual rental income is what the tenant is paying you. The debt service is otherwise known as your mortgage. And the annual operating expenses are the other expenses that are related to what it takes to own a house and to run the business and all that kind of stuff. So that's, for example, stuff like property taxes, which you have to pay usually once a year. You have property management. And all property management is if you get somebody to actually manage the house for you with the tenant in there. If the tenant has any questions, they go through the property manager. The property manager collects payments and all that kind of stuff. You have PMI if that's mortgage insurance. If you made a down payment less than 20%, you might have association fees here. If the house is in like a neighborhood that has like some sort of association fee, then you also have regular insurance. Home insurance is what that is. All right. So that is all that cash flow is, period. So what I want to talk about here is and let me say this too. So this is like rent. I'm sorry, annual rental income can include rent, but it also can include stuff like application fees. Um, Let me see what else. Late fees if the person pays late, and so on and so forth. You can also have stuff in there like if you rent out appliances to the client. So all that stuff, I mean not the client, but the tenant. So all that stuff is rental income minus annual debt service minus annual operating expenses. So the math behind cash flow for a rental property is extremely straightforward. It's not really that complicated at all. Now, here's the thing. The thing to remember about the math of cash flow is that you assume that cash flow is positive, meaning, in other words, after debt service is paid, after annual operating expenses are paid, you still have some residual, which means positive cash flow. Now, you can have negative cash flow, and that means that whatever rent that you're bringing in is not enough to cover your debt service or your mortgage or your operating expenses. You don't want that. That essentially means that you made a bad investment, that you essentially you're almost paying the person to stay inside of your home. And that's not why you go into real estate investment. So yeah. So this so obviously, to understanding the math behind this stuff, basically, you know that when you're talking about cash flow, you want it to be positive. So that means that you have to maximize, you have to make sure that annual rent income is as high as it should be. I'm not saying overcharging, but I'm just saying, make sure you're charging a rate that you can charge determined by the market and what the house is worth and all that kind of stuff. You might even also be interested in maximizing this number annual rental income by, renting out appliances, because that'll increase rental income, or other things like that. You also want to minimize these two minuses, right? So again, if to maximize this, you want to also maximize the positive number, which would be the annual rental income, and minimize these negative numbers, these numbers that are being subtracted. So with mortgage, you want to make sure that you're not paying too much for a house. In other words, like perhaps, you have that could mean that you finance too much on the house, or you're really just paying too much for what the house is actually worth. Okay, so make sure that's a way to minimize debt service. To minimize operating expenses, you want to make sure that if you can make a good down payment, if you make a large down payment, like at least 20%, you won't have PMI, for example. So you'll be able to eliminate that. You might decide, I don't want property taxes. I mean, not property taxes. I don't want property management. I'll manage it myself. So you take out that operating expense there. That's a way to minimize it. And then shop around for insurance and make sure that you're not paying too much for your insurance. So the main thing about cash flow is, with the math of cash flow, it's really basic addition and subtraction. But you want to make sure that so let me say this, to maximize cash flow, you want to maximize the positive, which is that rental income, and minimize the negatives, which are debt service, otherwise known as mortgage, and operating expenses. So again, it's not really that much to understand, very complicated about cash flow. But when you think about cash flow, the math of cash flow, you want to maximize the positive part of that equation, and you want to minimize the negative parts of those equations. That way you ensure that cash flow is as positive as it can be, which means that you have a good investment. So yeah, that's basically the nuts and bolts of it.